Milton.
Some instructions, like in
Milton.
PowerPoint.
Okay, we're now really starting. Welcome to the last session of this year's GigaNet. We have three very interesting papers that seem to be a bit diverse, but actually I think we'll find out that there are some very important common threads among all of them. And the first presentation will be, oh, there's nothing. Oh, hang on. Is it on? Is it on now? Yeah, okay. So we'll start over again. Welcome to the last session. Before I forget, Leo asked me to mention that the dinner is at 8. So those of you who will join the table at the restaurant, the cards of the restaurant are over there. And we'll meet up there at 8 for everybody who wants to join. Okay, so the last session features three very interesting papers that might seem a bit diverse, but they actually have a couple of very important common threads, and I think we'll identify those as we go along. And the first presentation will be by Andreas Kuhn on cookies versus clam. Andreas.
Hello everyone, my name is Andreas Kuhn at Syracuse University, and I always want to have the chance to talk about food at the conference, and here I go, I can talk about cookies versus clams. It's a talk on the clash of tracking technologies and their implications for online privacy. And before I actually go into the talk, I want to provide you with some background. What we're doing at Syracuse University, it's research on deep packet inspection, where we're basically looking at different kind of application across different institutions and countries, basically saying applications that doing the same ends with the same means. So there might be, for example, I'm sure you can't see because the screens are too small, applications of DPI for broad bandwidth management in the US compared to Canada, or behavioral advertising in the US compared to the UK. But obviously, there are other kind of technology that could be used to achieve similar ends. Basically, when we look at advertising, can be done in other ways, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the question of, is there application with the same end but different means, and what does that mean for policy implications when we look at online tracking and behavioral advertising, given all conditions are held constant or similar? We can do that because both cases that we're going to look at are more or less evolving at around the same time within the US. Another interesting aspect of this is also that because we have a lot of different applications that somehow take place in roughly about the same time, we can see kind of policy implications across different applications. And I'm aware of this slide is very small, and I was hoping having a little bit larger screen, but this is more for the purpose of illustrating the general point that there are deep packet inspection technologies and other alternative technology, as I call them, which can achieve similar ends but with different means. So why talking about online tracking behavioral advertising? Advertising in the internet is a defining characteristic for many internet companies in terms of their business model and revenue that they get. For example, Google's revenue consists of 96% out of their advertisement business that they do. So it's a very important characteristic of their business model. Online advertising can be conceptualized as a two-sided market, and we will come briefly across it again later in the presentation. I won't go into too many details, but just imagine as online advertising as a two-sided market where you have on one side the advertisers that want to get as many as possible eyeballs looking at their messages, and on the other side there are users who want to use free services, and those free services are provided by this platform or intermediary that brings both sides of the markets together. So what exactly is online behavioral advertising or behavioral tracking, as it's sometimes called? It's about users, online activities, and ISPs or other entities in the internet that are tracking those activities. And those are tracked and categorized and then aggregated into profiles to be later used or almost instantly used to display targeted advertising. Why is this interesting to do? Normally you can just charge more money for targeted advertising. It's in particular to know for this talk, I'm talking about the tracking function. There are a lot of other functions as profiling, matching, real-time auctioning or displaying of this advertising. But this kind of appears here for the purpose of clarity in this proverbial black box. I'm not going to talk about that, just about the actual targeting. So I try to structure those the same application with two different technologies as two paradigms, as two competing platforms. One are the cookies as a service platform, which is basically a user who goes on a website to visit a website, do things there, often using free services. And this activities in the cookies paradigm is tracked by cookies that are third-party cookies embedded in the website, and activities that the user is doing on this website are reported, for example, to an ad network that collects all those activities across different sites and gets an understanding what this user is doing. On the other side, we have the so-called clams or clams paradigm, which I call it to be an access platform, which involves the ISP in a very particular way. We were talking this morning a couple of times about deep packet inspection, and this kind of beautifully connects to what was said there. So here again, a user goes to a website, visits them, but the important point here is the network, the ISP, that connects the user to the internet, deploys some deep packet inspection technology, which basically inspects the traffic that is going through to its network. And based on that, activities such as search terms or website visit and so on can be inspected and tracked for the purpose of online advertising. So those are the two competing paradigms we're going to talk about and refer to in forms of two particular case studies. And the two cases I'm referring to is, on one side, the cookie case on Facebook Beacon, and the other one is called the NebuAd case, which used deep packet inspection for targeted advertising. So interestingly, both more or less happened around the same time at the end of 2007. At that time, Facebook was much smaller, it had about 50 million users, and why they engaged in this kind of technology was it was that time that Facebook had to prove that they are economically viable, so they would get some. They can make money out of the user base. What was happening there, they partnered up with 44 websites that sent the activities that users had on their website to Facebook, which in turn published those activities on Facebook's newsfeed. On the other side, you had this company NebuAd, who was partnering up with about 30 plus smaller US ISPs and trialed their technology for basically the same purpose, to get online behavior data about users to later use it for targeted advertising. Those companies covered, it was claimed, about roughly 10% of the US internet population. There were also some competitors, Azilla, FrontPorch, Kindside. We're not going to talk about them today, but just to get an idea, there's a kind of a larger ecosystem on that. Obviously, there are other actors like internet users, internet activist group, politicians, the US Congress, regulators and courts, and we're briefly referring to them. When we try to look at those events that were happening in those cases in form of a timeline, we can make up kind of like four stages that we go through, and I will quickly mention them here, and then even because of time reasons go very quickly to those two cases to get an idea what this is about. First is like this first stage where a service provider unilaterally deploys a particular technology for tracking or monitoring purposes. Often this is not disclosed to the users, but then out of a sudden, for one or the other reason, it is disclosed that this thing is happening, that monitoring is happening on their network. What then happened, consequently, there's like a public outcry, civil activism that says, oh, that's not a good thing, that should not happen. And often substantive pressure comes up, which makes often stop those companies doing to engage in particular practices. And the fourth stage, a little bit later, are political, regulatory, and legal proceedings that follow up with what's actually had happened. So, as said before, because of time reasons, I will be very short on those cases. They both kind of like start in a almost very similarly. They apply this particular technology, one cookies, one clams, and follow this don't ask for permission, apologize later approach. And both do that for economic reasons. Then in both cases there was some user discovery, but also some company discovery. There would be, if you have more time, some funny anecdotes to talk. So I would I'm glad to refer you to my paper to look in that into more detail. But interestingly, there the public disclosure is linked to net neutrality and privacy activism, which also was a hot topic at this particular time. Then we can see some form of civil activism that is in both cases kind of similar because it happens in the same country with the same institution. So you see academics writing about that this is not right, there are some privacy issues at hand, there are internet advocacy groups that come into play, Senate will hold hearings about these particular practices. What's interesting here is that the civil activism spurred considerable pressure in a larger context of a policy debate, and consequently, those companies back down from those practices. In the fourth stage, where we have political, legal, and regulatory proceedings, I could talk probably for at least half an hour about that, but to make it short here, both were sued in different instances for applying those practices. But what was interesting, for me at least, was to see there were like a couple of settlements coming up, but in no kind of lawsuit, no ISP or DPI was convicted of breaking the law. The same kind of thing happened with Facebook Beacon. They reached a settlement with the condition to stop using Facebook Beacon, and they were ordered to pay, not were ordered, but agreed in the settlement to pay $9.5 million to a privacy foundation. The interesting thing there is basically to say the outcome there was not determined by social political pressures, but by clash of norms and expectations. So it was not legality that determined this outcome. I have unfortunately to skip this here, for time reasons, and go directly into the discussion section. So what we could see as an outcome there's a triumph of the cookie paradigms, and we kind of asked the question, does this controversy has killed this technology that would have had competed with those cookie-based actors, which we kind of think, is this a win or a loss for privacy overall? Because since now there's just one established company with one particular set of actors engaging in this kind of techniques using cookies for online targeted advertising. A second point of discussion that we definitely see since the 2008 controversy that happened there was that those tracking capabilities of cookies also become stronger and stronger. So basically, we would claim now, saying that both kind of paradigms would have an equally impact on privacy. But interestingly, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, who is in charge of this, has strong concerns about the use of DPI by ISP and believes that other forms of tracking does not cause the same level of privacy concerns. That's a reason that we reject based on several reasonings or grounds. One is that if you look into what actually ISPs were doing, their tracking was limited in many ways. So they were not as comprehensively tracking as it was often told. On the same side, we see that there is a lot of technology progress in terms of tracking, of cookie-based tracking. There's a project called the Collusion. It's a browser plugin where you can put it up in your browser and see how much tracking is going on based on cookies. And the third reason why we reject this, and this is something that has not been done enough research on that, or has not been shown up as much in research, is basically the idea of integration of external data for profiling purposes. So it's not about the tracking itself, but it's about buying personal information from other sources and integrating with existing data that, for example, Facebook already has. So, important point here I want to make, this is not to argue in favor of DPI-based tracking, but just to make sure that there is a broader discussion, and there should be a broader discussion, an unbiased discussion on privacy issues overall on online behavioral advertising. I think I have a last second for short conclusions. Besides this clams-based paradigm that was defeated, there are new paradigms emerging. Browsers that send online activities to a proxy where it is analyzed, often said to do certain kinds of optimization, but they do as a side product is using those information for target advertising. Something similar is happening with wireless providers that have insights on those kind of communication. Second point is a transparency issue, which we found was interesting. Talking to many people in this area, we figured out that those companies who was most transparent upfront about potential privacy issues, they get hidden most by privacy advocates and so on. So basically they were forced to leave the market earlier than some other companies that were more secret about what they're actually doing. Basically there could be someone is still doing that, we still don't know about it. And kind of the last broader issue on it's kind of like a broader issue, rethinking ISP. So ISP have a very strategic position in its network, and in the example I was talking about, they were used for online targeting and so on. But the question comes up: could those capabilities also be used in a different way, basically in protecting people, protecting an open internet by those capabilities, and therefore kind of making a case that ensuring limited liability for those intermediaries would be important to achieve those kind of goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. One of the common themes for the three papers is that they all feature comparative analysis. Andreas took us through a privacy issue. We'll now go to a presentation of Nir Chetri of University of North Carolina, who looked at cybersecurity comparatively. Nir, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Nir Chetri. I'm from University of North Carolina at Greensboro from the business school, and I have been working on a policy, basically institutional and economic aspect of cybersecurity and cybercrime, which I published in the Global Cybercrime Industry book in 2010. And my next book about cybercrime and cybersecurity in the Global South, focusing on developing countries, is currently in production. It will be published in April of 2013. And basically my presentation today is based on two chapters from this book, which is one is about China and another is about India. Basically, looking at the institutional theory, institutional evolution, mainly academics have studied in more established industry, for example, the chemical industry and other more established industries. And these are cybersecurity and cybercrimes, comparatively new fields, and they may not necessarily follow the same path as the established field like chemical industry or other industries that they have studied these institutions. And looking at the cybersecurity in China and India, they have a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences. And my paper will focus on that. And this is a definition of cybersecurity from the ITU, and pretty standard definition, and probably I may not have a lot of time to talk about this definition of cybersecurity right now. And a little bit about institutions. Institutions basically are this is economics definition of institutions. Douglas North, who was the Nobel Prize winner in economics, had studied institutions for a long time, and his definition is that formal constraints like the rules, laws, and constitutions, informal constraints like the norms of behavior, conventions, and the self-imposed codes of conduct, as well as the way they are enforced, enforcement characteristics, are called institutions. And basically simple way to understand institutions is that institutional theory is the theory of legitimacy seeking. The idea is that legitimacy from a lot of stakeholders is no less important than the efficiency or the economic aspect when a lot of economic actors work to achieve some goals. And the approach that I have in my paper is mainly from the organizational theory. The Scott 2001 and 1995, another book. He also, similar to Douglas North, his idea of institutions, basically formal and informal institutions, he has categorized in three pillars, and they are the regulative pillars and normative pillars and cognitive pillars. And regulative pillars are basically the legally sanctioned behavior. Normative institutions are the morally governed type of behaviors, and cognitive institutions are the recognizable or taken for granted type of behaviors, or that is culture. And one way to understand this is regulatory players can be considered as the formal institutions, and normative and cognitive players can be considered as informal institutions. And also looking at the institutions and cyber security, the idea is that there are cyber security related regulatory bodies at the national and international level which are emerging, and also laws and regulations and enforcement mechanisms, and also a lot of these informal institutions, how they are evolving over time, and that is important thing. So I'll just skip this institutional field part, and I'll directly go to the example from China and India. So the idea here is how exactly institutions evolve. There are four mechanisms that I'm discussing. One is the co-evolution of organizations and institutions. Nelson has been studying these technology and institutions for a long time, and he and his colleagues have published a lot of papers. And the idea is that when technologies basically grow and they become mature, organizations co-evolve to basically use the technology in a creative way. One example is that there is a lot of cyber espionage activities allegedly originated from India, and they are basically Chinese government, according to these Western experts, is using the internet to engage in a lot of cyber espionage activity. And another example in India, for example, is the Computer Response Emergency Team. India or China or a lot of other countries have these, and this is an example of co-evolution of organizations and industry structure. And also institutions develop over time in response to changing situation. One example is the cloud computing, for example. If you look at cloud computing, many government consider cloud computing equal to the industrial revolution. And in China, for example, there is the special administrative region in the Chongqing province, and Chinese government is establishing basically that industry which is free from censorship, because Chinese government wants the companies to use the knowledge all over the world developed using cloud computing. And another example in India is the ministry. There is a memorandum of understanding with the US and India. Basically, US wants India to develop cybersecurity related institutions, given that India is emerging as a major technological hub and outsourcing destination for many US-based companies. And also, new institutions are built on existing institutions, and because of that, China and India have different focus, state's role versus the private sector's role. And also, these technologies might produce some type of contradictions and practices, and which lead to institutional evolution. One example is, for example, China's goal is to balance economic modernization and political control. And although China wants to control internet, and at the same time doesn't want to jeopardize the economic growth. And one example is the Sina, which is Sina Weibo, is one of the biggest social networking website in China, comparable to Twitter. And basically, Chinese government had the regulation of real name registration to use Twitter or other type of social networking website, and Sina Weibo basically continued to allow users without registering real name after the March 16 deadline, and government really did not do anything. And that is one example that there is a contradiction produced, and government is okay with that. And also, Indian outsourcing firms are facing a lot of pressure to strengthen their cybersecurity related behaviors. And for example, Indian workers in the offshoring sector have to go these very, very complicated security checks, although that is considered to be undignified in the Asian context. So I have these 8 propositions developed in terms of cybersecurity related institutions. 2 of them are related to thickness in institutions, and by thickness I mean the basically network of rules and norms related to cybersecurity, and also interaction among various actors, and these are the 2 related to thickness. And also I'm comparing the regulative, normative and cognitive institutions in the 2 countries, and what exactly is driving the behavior of various actors engaged in cybersecurity in the 2 countries. First, looking at China and India, in both countries there is a higher degree of digitization, and because of higher degree of digitization, they are kind of facing a pressure to enhance their cybersecurity related institutions. If you look at China, e-commerce is more than $703 billion in 2010, and if you look at India, outsourcing industry generated more than $88 billion in the last fiscal year. And basically, because of the digitization, increasing digitization Association, Indian and Chinese governments are working to enhance cybersecurity and also the private sector. And also both countries are experiencing more and more cybercrime, and that is basically forcing the Chinese government, Indian government, and also these trade associations like the Chinese hackers, and they are basically working to enhance cybersecurity related institutions in both the countries. And looking at regulative institutions, basically the idea in my third proposition is that China has a very strong state and a lot of resources to develop cybersecurity related institutions. For example, there are more than 900 hackers, according to some estimates, that closely work with the government, and 30,000 to 40,000 cyber police who basically patrol the internet, and all these things are basically driving the cybersecurity related behaviors in China. And India, on the other hand, is very weak state and doesn't have as much resources as China does, and doesn't have a lot of manpower. For example, if you look at Delhi, Delhi city, which is the capital city of India with more than 20 million people, had only 2 police officers working on cybersecurity, compared to China has 30,000 to 40,000 patrolling the internet. And also Mumbai city had 4,400 police officers. That is a little old data in 2004. Only 5 of them knew a little bit about cybersecurity. And one example is one police officer was asked to go and collect evidence related to from a guy hacker who attacked websites, and he brought basically screen of the computer rather than bringing the hard drive. So basically India doesn't have that resources. And looking at the normative institutions, in normative institutions I'm mainly focusing on the trade association, and a very good example of trade association in India that is driving cybersecurity behavior is the National Association of Software and Service Companies, NASSCOM, which has more than 1,200 Indian and foreign companies as members. And NASSCOM is working basically taking a lot of measures to drive cybersecurity related behaviors in India. For example, works with police officers, lawyers, industry bodies, and also basically taking a lot of measures to educate police officers, training them, and judge, and all those things. And Data Security Council of India is similar type of body, and basically which is basically about enforcing cybersecurity, in which can fine up to $1 million for those companies if they do not comply with cybersecurity related institutions. And in China, on the other hand, there is, for example, Internet Society of China, which is considered similar to NASSCOM in India, which doesn't do anything and anything related to NASSCOM. And basically, the ISC's role is to enforce whatever the government regulations are, and very weak normally there's civil society in China. And cognitive institutions, the basic idea here is that the government is helping to bring awareness about cybersecurity among firms and individuals in China. And in India, trade association is playing more important roles to educate people and educate companies to take more cybersecurity related institutions. And probably because of the time constraints, I will just go to my final slide. And basically, these institutions are thickening in the two countries. And thickening institutions might help to provide formal trust, because formal trust means these companies engaged in economic transaction do not have to depend on the history of transaction among them, and they can depend more on the institutions, developed institutions, and that is called institutionally based trust, that is evolving in both India and China, but in a different way. And also government agencies are playing more important role in China, and regulative component is dominating the behavior of cybersecurity, and India trade associations are dominating the emergence of those behavior, and there is a higher degree of institutionalization in China compared to India because of the more resources and government's stronger roles compared to trade associations roles in India. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nir. The last presentation, before we go to the Q&A, is from Jana Breindl from the University of Göttingen. And this time a comparative analysis in Europe on access blocking. Jana.
Okay. Hello, can you all hear me? Because I can't really see you, I'm very short, so I wished I could maybe move the microphone, maybe I just stand here. So hello everybody, my name is Jana Breindl. I'm working at the Göttingen Center for Digital Humanities, which is a new center that has been created 1 year ago. And the research I'm going to present today is actually something I carried out while I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I'm going to focus on discourse networks on state-mandated access blocking in France and Germany. So often when you hear talks about access blocking, internet blocking in general, most of the research that has been conducted has been carried out in authoritarian states. The examples are often China, Pakistan, Azerbaijan is also one of those countries. And there's much less research on liberal democracies. So I'm going to more focus on this area. Here's a short outline of the presentation. So internet blocking, unfortunately, is becoming more and more of a global norm, not an exception. Most states or private actors tend to resort to some type of access restrictions. Also, there are clearly different reasons for this. So one of the examples which I'm going to focus on here is mainly the child pornography, the debate about, which has been mentioned already by Nicole early on. And there are, in the general internet blocking debates, three trends that have been identified by McIntyre. One is that it's kind of an outsourcing of like finding technological solutions to policy problems. So basically using automatic and self-enforcing mechanisms to deal with problematic content such as copyrighted material or child pornography. The second, and this has also been mentioned earlier on in the presentations, it's the indirect enforcement through intermediaries. As the state doesn't have necessarily a direct access to the internet, it's generally asking ISPs to regulate and to intervene in the content carried. And also a preference for self-regulation, which has been the predominant area for content regulation on the internet. And of course, this raises a series of legal, political, and technical issues that can be looked at from two different perspectives. One is looking at the questions that raise it in terms of democratic principles, for example, civil liberties, freedom of expression, privacy, etc., but also in terms of the practical implementation. This is especially in liberal democracies, the debate about the effectiveness of this type of measures, but also the costs and potential abuses of these blocking mechanisms. So my research focuses more on countries in Western Europe, particularly France and Germany, but they are not really isolated in resorting to internet blocking, especially of child pornographic material. There has been in the UK some self-regulatory mechanisms imposed under the threat of regulation. So often ISPs are told if they don't regulate by themselves, there will be some type of mandatory state regulation. Also, European-wide, there is a series of hotlines to detect particularly problematic content and to filter out, mainly resorting to DNS-type blocking. But more recently, in Germany in 2009, and in France in 2011, there have been two laws that have been adopted and which I'm going to examine in more detail here. So I'm going to focus on discourse. I'm not going to focus in this presentation on institutional variables, but really on the discourse, because discourse constrains political actions, as has been recognized in the literature on political science and also social movement researchers, particularly the importance of frames, which can diagnostic a certain problem. Basically, often in this case, it's arguing that internet content or the internet itself is a forum, a platform for cybercriminality, as has been discussed previously, but also for a rapid increase of sharing of content that is quite problematic. And here in this research, I'm going to focus on the media debates. And in media debates, you can generally see coalition, discourse coalition forming around certain storylines or narratives. So here I'm building on research that had been carried out previously, looking at what makes up a successful discourse coalition. So basically, what type of actors or network of actors can successfully intervene in a policy debate. So here are a series of criteria that has been results from the literature analyzed by other authors. So one is that already there should be lots of actors, so a large constituency. The other one is that the actors or the networks should dominate the core frames of the conflict, that there should be a strong ideational congruence, so that people should refer to the same type of frames. Consistent storyline, so the frames they use should make sense. And also use a broad but not too diverse frame bundle. And also the stability over time. So there shouldn't be too many differences over time. So the method I'm using is discourse network analysis that has been proposed by Leifert, which is a German political scientist, and which basically combines social network analysis with computer-assisted qualitative content analysis. And basically what you do is you look at media articles, you can look at position papers from interest groups, etc. And you code it using typical content analysis methods, and the particular software allows you then to extract this and to perform network analysis. And in this paper, I'm mainly going to focus on congruence networks. And if you look at the graphs, I don't know if you see it really well. Basically, when two actors, here you have the two A's who refer to frame 1. If both refer to the same phrase, there is basically a link created by the software. And this is the links I'm going to focus on in the case studies. So here a few more details about the methods. I looked at Germany and France. There were far more articles covered in, in France and in Germany. Notably because I looked at more newspapers in Germany to have a broad representation of a left to right spectrum of newspapers. All are quality newspapers, but still what was quite clear is also that in Germany the internet blocking bill generated much more media debate than was the case in France. In France, the law I'm going to look at generated lots of media debate too, but most articles didn't relate to internet blocking because the bill was concerned with a much broader range of issues, and so there were only 76 articles that I included in the analysis. There are more details about the methods in the paper if you're interested in it. But let's turn to the findings. So the main finding is that internet blocking became a political and media issue in Germany, but not in France. And this can be explained by a series of reasons. First is, of course, the scope of the bills. The German bill focused only on internet blocking of child pornographic material, while in France it was the measure was included in a much broader law about security issues and cybercriminality. It can also be explained by institutional characteristics, the differences between Germany being a federal state, and this is quite important in the sense that, especially on online content, there has been a big debate in Germany about who is actually competent for this. And this has also been the case in those debates. While in France it's a more centralized state, so there hasn't been this debate about competences on online content. A very important factor was also the fact that there were elections in Germany just after the law was passed. Activists were also arguing very early on that the proposition to install internet blocking measures was mainly an electoral move by the government. In France, there was an important decision by the Constitutional Court arguing that, contrary to what it had done on the previous Hadopi bill, which installed a graduated response mechanism in France, that basically internet blocking was allowed and coherent with constitutional principles for the protection of children. But what I'm going to focus more in the next slides is really the structure of the discourse networks that was also quite different in both countries. So, sorry. This is a graph showing the German debate, so the media debates and all the statements that have been coded. In red you can see the statements against internet blocking, and in blue the statements in favor. I'm not sure if you can see it really well, but basically the main peaks you can see coincide with important policy events. So in Germany what happened is that first the government tried to convince the main ISPs to make a contract that they would self-regulate and block child pornography by themselves. This didn't work because the ISPs wanted a legal basis for it. Yes, okay, I think I will be a little bit over time. Finally, the bill was adopted in a very, very short amount, so it's still on the first peak. I don't know if you can see the second line, which is the 18th of June 2009, where the bill was adopted. After that, you had elections in Germany and a change in the governing coalitions, actually, where the Liberals became a coalition partner and decided not to basically drop the internet blocking measures. And then it led to more debate when in February the law was still in place. There was a constitutional complaint. In parallel, you had also debates at the European Union level about a directive that would implement internet blocking measures and maybe indirectly bring them back to Germany. And finally, the debate evened out and the bill was revoked in 2011. So this is two networks, in red again the opponents, in blue the proponents, and this basically shows the nodes are the main organizations. You can see, I don't know if you can see it really well, but it's all in the papers if you want to have a closer look. But clearly the opponents were more numerous and more densely connected. This is a broad graph of the main frames that were used. The main frame was clearly effectiveness. Was internet blocking effective at all? In red, again, you can see the claims against internet blocking, on blue in favor. What was very interesting in Germany here is that not only did the opponents, which were mainly activists from civil society, but also politicians, for example, the liberals, etc., didn't only focus on effectiveness, like on this democratic, like how do you call it, the principles and the practical arguments, but they also actually proposed a coherent alternative, kind of a leitmotif, which was you shouldn't block the content but remove it. And this is framed here as alternatives, which was the second one. And this was also became really the leitmotif of the movement and was later on taken over by even persons who were in favor of the blocking at first. I'm going to skip a few slides because I think I'm probably already out of time. But just to say, over time, the opponents were more numerous, they were more densely connected, and also in terms of clustering, they grew really strongly, especially towards the end of the debate. And this indicates basically that many of the persons who were at the beginning claiming that internet blocking should be introduced, later on shifted sides, so clearly an inversion of the debate. Now let's look quickly at France. Interestingly, both debates happened more or less at the same time. The measures were announced in March 2009, followed by a peak in the discussions. The bill was finally adopted, debated. It went through the different chambers, the National Assemblies and the Senate. It was adopted in December 2011. And finally, there was in March 2011 the Constitutional Council decision approving of the internet blocking measures. So here again you have both networks. Here you can clearly see that there were far more opponents than proponents in general, with only a few very important, very vocal actors. In terms of the frames, mainly two important frames, effectiveness and the constitutional legal one. Effectiveness was clearly dominated by the opponents, while the proponents focused much more on the constitutional and legal, which was also in France the key arguments of the debate. So nearly to finish, also in France still more opponents than proponents. But in terms of the density, even so there was a certain drop in the middle of the debate, the proponents became much more densely connected towards the end of the debate. So to conclude, opponents were clearly more numerous in both cases, and also in terms of the type of actors in Germany, there was a broad opposition across all actors, while the politicians were actually divided. While in France there was a broad opposition too, but especially the telecommunication industry was actually in favor of the case. While in both cases ISPs were generally sometimes participating in both coalitions. The core frames were dominated by the opponents in Germany, and as I said, what was really interesting was that they proposed an alternative to remove and not block, which was taken over by all actors of the discourse. Of the debate, sorry. While in France, the proponents dominated mainly the principles, the constitutional, is it constitutional or not, and basically avoided the practical debate. In Germany, too, there was a broad bundling by opponents, while in France, they didn't really connect their frame really well with their authors. So the effectiveness claim was a bit standing by itself. So Germany, as I said, the opponents grew more cohesive over time, with more and more proponents becoming part of their network, while in France, the proponents were highly connected at the beginning and at the end of the debate. And I think I will leave it here and not stand more in between you and dinner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana. We've had 3 presentations that and I want to thank the speakers for staying remarkably well on time, which means we not only made up for the delay earlier in the program, but we're actually ahead of schedule now. So I think this produces, let's say, a contract with the audience, because I think you now are responsible to actually thoroughly engage with the speakers, and then I promise if the questions are good enough, I will end 15 minutes early according to the program, and then we've all done our jobs and we can feel good about ourselves and move on to the evening program. So to kick off the discussion, just one brief observation from my perspective. What really intrigued me is that each of your papers presents a technical phenomenon and then shows how the same technical phenomenon leads to completely different outcomes under different institutional conditions. So the same privacy intrusion leading to 2 very different outcomes, or similar privacy intrusion, and the same holds for the cybersecurity policy and the access blocking. Now, maybe this question is a bit too broad, but I'm going to throw it out there and see if you can do something with it. Can you, you've heard the other speakers, can you reflect on what the driving forces are that shape these technologies so differently, in different directions, in each of your cases? Because you have, all of you have brought different players into the foreground. So Jana has talked a lot about basically the state and in the end also the private sector, how it engaged with the proposals. That was similar, I think, to Nir's analysis. And Andreas, you had the private sector a bit more in the lead, I guess, but that doesn't really explain on its own why these outcomes are so different. So I wonder if I can ask you to reflect on what you've heard and how that maybe also sheds new light on your own case analysis. Who wants to go first?
Start?
Okay.
So my comparison of China and India, the evolution of cybersecurity related institutions basically indicate that in China it is kind of internal motivation, and Chinese government wants to balance the goal of economic modernization and political control, and Chinese government is doing to balance the 2 things in whatever way it can. In India's case, basically India is facing a lot of pressure from these Western companies, and because India is a big outsourcing hub generating more than 88 billion US dollar last time, and facing pressure from US government or US companies or the European companies to enhance cybersecurity related institutions, especially in the offshoring sector, because otherwise they will not get the business of these Western companies, given that there are a lot of instances of these internal, basically employees stealing a lot of information of these Western customers and selling them on the market. And so because of that pressure, offshoring companies are pretty good in India. Their security standard is comparable or even better than those many Western companies, and Indian economy is basically experiencing kind of spillover effect of that strong cyber security. But the government doesn't have any resources to do anything in India compared to China. So these are the major differences between China and India.
Tough question. I think I think you can start from very different points of that, but to be a little bit more abstract, basically as I said, there might be different technologies or the same technology. So in our research, what we're doing, we're using a concept by Sharp called actor-centered institutionalism, which basically tries to understand what actors interact with each other, how they do make decisions, and how this kind of interaction comes to one or the other outcome. So basically, the institutions play a major role in this. So when you compare across different countries, you would assume different kind of institutions which might explain one or the other outcome. And another point is kind of like the kind of technology that is used. So I was talking about online advertising, right, which is something that is done by private actors. And so one of the slides that I had to skip because of time was kind of the understanding there is some new technology introduced that is somehow disruptive, and therefore might challenge existing laws, or not challenging existing laws because there is no law or legal norm that they could apply. So kind of new regime or new institutions might emerge to that. There might be institutions in kind of a legal sense, or more norms that kind of govern this. On the other side, we have seen in both of your cases, there are more kind of like other kind of technologies where the state has certain obligations to, child pornography. There are some legal norms there that need to be enforced, and how this is put into place. And so it's kind of a little bit a different approach, and I think that's still of part of all of our questions. Why do we have different outcomes in that? That seems to be one of the connecting questions into that, from my point of view.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's exactly why I carried out this study, and why I'm going to continue working on these issues too. And basically, in the case of France and Germany, you have a very similar policy problem, which is how to deal with this type of online content. And this is a problem that most liberal democracies face nowadays, and authoritarian states for different types of content. And of course, we expect that the way they will react, or states will react to it, and private actors will behave, will be different depending on the institutional settings, and on the, I was more focusing on the media debates, which are of course shaped by those institutional settings, but where you could still, what I was surprised, for example, was that still the claims or the frames were very similar in both countries. And one of the main differences between Germany and France is the type of democracy they actually have. And in Germany, it's a much more consensual approach. So you will have much more discussions, much more trying. You could see it in this debate too, that the government first tried to find an agreement with the ISPs to kind of deal with these problems. While in France, and this has been very particular to the Sarkozy government too, which is really to reassert the state sovereignty. In many of his discourses, you will find this wishing to civilize the internet, or to make it more responsible, etc. Even so, the institutional factors were different, and the outcome is maybe different. It's still the question whether in practice, even if it's state-regulated or self-regulated, it's still some type of regulation. So I think, nonetheless, the differences, even in Germany, if the bill has been revoked, there's no no legislation as such, but there's still the same type of content restrictions. So I think that's also something we have to keep in mind.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, something I would like to add to what you just said, or in particular your research, I found interesting. So you're kind of looking in particular at France and Germany, and at least it's not a very academic view, but at least my personal view. My impression was that both countries, when it comes to internet activism, are probably the strongest one within Europe, right? They are both large countries. They have a well-established group who are engaging in this kind of topic. So the question is kind of how would this kind of discourse, besides all the institutional difference, look like if you would have a very different kind of internet activism culture? So this might be an interesting kind of argument there.
Yeah. But that was one thing I found interesting, and where I had some questions about your research too, about more when you mentioned the civil activism, etc. But actually in France, I did my PhD on digital rights activism at the European level, and I interviewed quite some activists across the EU, and I would say that actually it's more even Sweden who would be even stronger in terms of, especially in this type of activism. And actually the activism in Germany and France is quite different. In Germany you have a very strong privacy movement, while in France it's more on copyright, and actually if I would have done the same case study on the Hadopi law, graduated response, copyright issues, I think it would have been more vibrant in France. But I think that in Germany the mediatization of the activism is much stronger, so they have a much more broader impact. They're much more noticed in the media compared to France, where they generally remain on the online sphere, but find it very difficult to go penetrate traditional media.
They reflect somehow the cases that were kind of like hot in this particular countries, I guess, right?
Yeah. I wanted to, I had to compare the same type of issue. I wanted to.
No, sure, I understand, and not just in terms of how internet activism is like shaped, what they care about and what they're famous for, as you pointed out. Yeah.
But one question I had about your research was how, because you said that when there was activism about those issues, it actually stopped. That ISPs would stop. But do you have any empirical evidence to really, or is it just a hypothesis you have?
That it stopped?
Yeah, or that it decreased?
Oh, so yeah, sure. It was actually pretty simple. So in both cases, in particular, the DPI case, the company closed down. So the company doesn't exist anymore today. Another company will engage in same practices closed down too, as a result of congressional pressure. And there are a couple of other smaller companies / less transparent companies that are still in the market, but they changed in one or the other way their business model so they could somehow justify those activities that might be kind of offering free managed security services or a clear opt-in choice, which was not the case at the first place.
Okay. Well, we don't want to
I actually thought that was very enlightening. There are excellent. The first question. Somebody carrying a microphone? Oh, there it is.
Does it work?
It does, yeah.
Okay. One question to Andreas and one to Nir. Andreas, I was kind of impressed by your statement, which is for me counterintuitive, that the nice guys get hammered on and the bad guys get away with murder. So could you a little bit explain on that? And Nir, both India and China are real big players, but although they're big, they're in a global concert. And do you see their kind of policy to have proprietary standards, specifications, requirements for security equipment as part of a security strategy or as part of industrial policy? Thanks.
I can briefly start with that. So what we saw in this particular case, but also in other cases, was that, in particular in case of Nebiat, that they tried to engage with certain privacy activists early on. They had connections to DC. They tried to get involved in the political process. And were kind of transparent to a certain degree what they were doing early on in this process. And that seemed to have been not a very successful strategy for them, because they got the most media attention, and as a consequence of this media attention, they were kind of punished most compared to others that were quiet on during the entire time. And we have something kind of similar happened to Forum in the UK, and it's not to say there are the good or the bad guys. It's just really about the degree of transparency, and if a company is transparent or someone else makes them transparent what they were doing, they get full attention. As a consequence out of that, they might get more attention that they would love to. And compared to those companies that might be completely that we don't know about what they're actually doing, and there are those companies that have less direct customer relation or customer interaction. They're kind of monitoring, as I was talking about, the third-party cookies that are monitoring from a more remote side what's happening, and it's less obvious to the customer that actually something is monitored. So kind of to put this first statement more in this kind of a relation. If that, yeah.
Okay, just regarding the question about if India and China have different type of equipment related to standardization, security or policy, basically China clearly wants to focus more on the information security aspect rather than cyber security. For example, they have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization consisting of these 4 economies: China, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and they basically do not want these Western countries to monopolize on the information and communication technology industry. And China has pretty big these players in information and communication technology industry, and so they are basically, they want their own standard. They want to develop their own security related equipment. India, on the other hand, is more inclined towards this Council of Europe treaty, and so it is not a member, but India's policy are mainly driven by the U.S. government. Basically, U.S. government wants India to develop more cyber security related capabilities so that U.S. companies outsourcing to India would be more secure. So I don't really see a lot of standardized and related policies that the Indian government is taking, mainly working on external pressure. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. So, of course, I mean, I did enjoy the good paper of compare China and India, and also it's my first time to learn a lot of good points from Mr. Nier. And oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Qian Tang from CNIC, the national registry running .cn. So, well, not the government, but we are running .cn. So. Yes, I mean, I know there's a lot of good points and the numbers. So from our point of view, we want to more collaboration with you. Because, I mean, when you try to demonstrate your point, you give a list of numbers. And also, I mean, CNIC is doing the national quality research paper, and especially on the statistics of the Chinese internet. And according to our research, by the end of June, we have more than 500 million internet users, and we have 400 million instant messenger users, and we have more than 350 million users of micro web blog. So, and I mean, the reason I list these numbers is not only because the number is big. The point is the number almost double